You guys are just like us. You guys, we can't, maybe we don't get along very well, but this Jesus hasn't helped you guys get along any better. We have rough lives and we've got a lot to complain about, but you guys do too. I mean, what's God done for you? You're always complaining. When we do this, we begin to speak again the hellish language of our former master. We work against God's good work in us. We oppose what the Holy Spirit is seeking to create in us, this spirit of contentment and humility. Grumbling and disputing, they detract from the glory that's due to our God and Savior.
Hey everyone, it's Katie from Without a Crystal Ball. Welcome back to my channel. It's Monday, June 12th, 2023. I hope you are having a wonderful day. All right, so listen, Ben Seewald has spoken. And in an hour-long sermon at his church, Emmanuel Baptist Church in Springdale, Arkansas, Ben spent the better part of that time talking about grumbling and complaining, where he spoke about how you should not complain or grumble because it's sinful, and that complaining and grumbling and whining and arguing is not godly. He pulled this from the book of Philippians in the Bible, the New Testament, from a specific verse, and he built an entire sermon around these little tiny words, this 2-sentence verse, to tell people that it's better to just be nice to people than it is to complain. Now, he also praised his own congregation for handling their disputes without complaining or grumbling, and that it's not Christian to complain or grumble. Here's the thing. Throughout this sermon, he lays out examples that tell me that he's talking about the complaining and the grumbling that he believes has occurred in this new docuseries by people that are complaining and grumbling about their faith, about Jim Bob Duggar, about the IBLP, and the wider discussion about the Christian movement. There has been a really bad portrayal of some believers believing that people that participated in this series were not Christian, and that because they were not Christian, they hate Christians. Many of the people that participated in the series are 100% Christians. So there's that. The fact that Ben spent this amount of time discussing complaining and grumbling a week after this comes out, knowing that he's in Jim Bob's pocket and knowing that he's done things like this in the past, specifically when Derek speaks out, Ben seems to get the most triggered when Derek and Jill are involved in something. He did this when Derek spoke out against Jim Bob during the elections. And he called out something, I think it was about gossiping and how it's bad to gossip and you shouldn't gossip. And he always pulls out biblical verses. So what I'm going to do in this video is I pulled out my Bible, my pink, beautiful Bible that I had when I was going to church. And while I might be an atheist today, I still love the Gospels. I know that might sound ridiculous or weird because I'm not a Christian. There are lots of really valuable teachings, I think, in these Gospels that are applicable to everyday life. And if you look at it in that context, there's nothing wrong with some of these teachings. Like some of the things I see in here and I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be hanging out in the book of Matthew and a little bit in the book of Luke. And I'm going to talk to Ben a little bit about why he's being a little bit hypocritical. And we're also going to show some of you some of the context of what he was talking about. Ben comes to the defense of Jim Bob Duggar, and by telling complainers and whiners to shut up, he's producing and endorsing toxic positivity within the church, which stands up and elevates abusers and allows victims not to be heard and to be silenced. And so while Jed is not sticking with the victims, neither are Ben and Jessa. And So let's dive into today's topic. Before we do, can you please do me a big favor and give this video a thumbs up? Also, please subscribe to my channel if you've not yet subscribed by clicking on the subscribe button down below. Make sure to click on the bell so you can get notified of any time I go live and new content loads, and share this video with your friends. The very beginning of his sermon is designed around a passage in Philippians, okay? Philippians is a book of the New Testament. It is a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote, and he is using chapter 2, verse 14 through 16. And the verse says, "Do all things without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky, as you hold firmly to the word of life, and then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain." So the second chapter of Philippians is really about like being a good Christian and how to work out your salvation and how to walk in your like life of Jesus Christ. Okay, and so I'm using a reference on biblical Bible references for this, so you don't think that I'm making this up. The context of this is that Philippians explains how Christians ought to live considering all that Christ is willing to do for them. And it commands them to work out salvation is a directive to let the new birth in Christ translate into actions. As part of this, believers should serve God without griping and complaining. Paul knows that his service to God has been hard, but this is simply another form of offering. All Christians are invited to serve in the same selfless way. So it's about selfless service to God, okay? Now, a lot of people will pull out these Bible verses and say that Christians, if they're going to be serving God and they're going to be Christians, can't complain because their whole life is about serving God. In the world of the cult and in the world of Ben and Jessa, they're going to view their whole lives, in my opinion, as serving God. And so to them, any amount of complaining or griping is not allowed, okay? So here's what Ben has to say.
Well, the main idea of these verses, the central thought in a sentence would be this, that complaining and arguing, grumbling and disputing are forbidden because they dim the light that we are to be in this world. Complaining and arguing are forbidden because they dim the light that we're to be in this world. These things directly undermine our mission. They lie about our redeemed identity, about who God has made us to be and who He's making us to be. They misrepresent the goodness and the glory of our Heavenly Father.
You heard from Ben that complaining and griping and grumbling is against the mission of God to be a servant of God that's always happy and joyful, and that you shouldn't be complaining in your walk with God as you're serving God and as you're being a Christian, and that it goes against their mission, which is to spread the word of the gospel. Now, why I think it's strange that this happens to be that he's going through the book of Philippians is that he didn't start going into the book of Philippians until the very end of April. Now, the book of Philippians is largely known as by a letter from the Apostle Paul about the Christian life and about the Christian walk in life. And he didn't start this until April 30th. He decided to go on a sort of walk through the book of Philippians right as news hit that they were going to have the Duggar Docuseries be going out, and it was given a premiere date. An article comes out, they start talking about it the end of April. April 30th, he decides that he is going to start talking from the book of Philippians. And then he goes through and he cherry picks some chapters. He doesn't even start in the beginning. He starts 12 through 18, 18 through 26, and then he skips ahead 27 to 30, and then he starts in chapter 2, and he does 1 through 11, 5 through 12. Last week he does 12 and 13, only 2 verses, and this week it's 14 through 16. So he timed this in a way that he, by the end of that week that the docuseries comes out that he could speak about grumbling and complaining. That does not feel coincidental to me at all, given that he skipped verses in Philippians and that he cherry picked and spent a whole week on one Bible verse. Ben is not stupid, and he will do just about anything to become and look as though he's self-righteous. Now, to me, when Ben does this kind of stuff, and he did this whole thing about rudeness to Derek when Derek spoke out against Jim Bob, when he does this kind of stuff, I feel like he is being a virtue signaler to Jessa, which says, look at Jessa. She's not complaining. She's not being rude. She's had the same circumstances as Jill, and she's not grumbling and whining and complaining. Sure, in the book of Philippians, this is what Paul says about what the Christian life is. But there's the Gospels, which actually kind of contradict and sort of set rules and like lessons from Jesus about how to handle Pharisees, false prophets, how to treat children, how to treat people that completely contradict no complaining and griping. Not all things that you say that are negative are complaints or gripes or grumbles. But let's continue with what Ben says.
Sometimes we complain against others, and we know that from later in Philippians in chapter 4, there was some factions within the church. There was these two women, Euodia and Syntyche, who were butting heads and disagreeing. And so perhaps, as one commentator speculates, there was maybe moaning and gossiping and whispering campaigns that were going on, perhaps complaining and grumbling about one another, across those walls of division. But ultimately, grumbling is against God and against his sovereign will. Grumbling and complaining is forbidden, but also we see disputing. Disputing is forbidden. This another word for this would just be arguing.
What I find so bizarre about this situation is that in this sermon, which, by the way, I'm just giving you tiny clips, Ben is not staying in Philippians. Instead, he's jumping into the Old Testament, and he goes to Genesis, and then he's talking about Cain. He's talking about Moses. He doesn't stay in Philippians, and he doesn't stay on message. And even in the same speech where he's talking about how you are supposed to not whine or grumble, he jumps ahead to chapter 4 of Philippians, which involves two women, and he brings up gossiping. What amazes me about this, though, is that in chapter 4, it doesn't even say anything about gossiping, but he brings up gossiping and he brings up women. And who is primarily in the series? Women. Who are the women? Who are the primary voices from the family that are sharing their sides of the story in the series? Women. The only man is Derek Dillard. The rest are Jill, Amy, and Deanna. He says that chapter 4 shows a division in the church and factions. All chapter 4 says, now I appeal to Euodia and Syntyche, please, because you belong to the Lord, settle your disagreement. And I ask you, my true partner, to help these two women, for they worked hard with me in telling others the good news. They worked along with Clement and the rest of my coworkers whose names are written in the book of life. Always be full of joy in the Lord. I say it again, rejoice. Let everyone see that you are considerate in all that you do. Remember, the Lord is coming soon. There's no implication that there's gossiping. There's no implication about anything. These two women are in a dispute, and he's asking them to settle their disagreement. But he's applying gossip in a way that suggests that the only thing that women would ever fight about is gossip, which is stupid. And it also tells me that it's just his overall view of women. But in general, let me just say this. The women that were on the series were not gossiping. They were not disagreeing about something mundane like doctrine or fighting about theology. They were actually talking about abuse. They were talking about trafficking. They were talking about SA. They were talking about cover-ups. They were talking about greed. They were talking about control. They were talking about corporal punishment. They were talking about being controlled by patriarchs that were hurting them. They were talking about a system that was oppressing people. They were calling out Pharisees, which is kind of what Jesus called for his people to do, which is ironic because Jesus talks about false prophets so much in the book of Matthew. In like chapter 7, verse 15, he says, "Beware of false prophets who come disguised as harmless sheep, but are really vicious wolves. You can identify them by their fruit, that is, by the way they act. Can you pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? A good tree produces good fruit, and a bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree can't produce bad fruit, and a bad tree can't produce good fruit. So every tree that does not produce good fruit is chopped down and thrown into the fire." And yes, just as you can identify a tree by its fruit, so can you identify people by their actions. All they were doing is following Matthew 7 and identifying people by their actions and calling out bad fruit in their system, which they say you can do. But apparently you can't call out bad fruit because Ben says you can't complain. There's an entire chapter in the book of Matthew on criticizing religious leaders, chapter 23, where he talks about all the religious leaders that do things that are harmful, that put greed in front of their people, that are hypocritical, and how that these Pharisees and hypocrites will be exposed, and how these Pharisees and hypocrites are what cause harm to Christians, not the complaints, not the gossip, the people that claim to speak for Christ that hurt people through Christ. And then in chapter 12 of Luke, Jesus warns about hypocrisy. And that is about people that literally do one thing and act another. So he said, "Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, their hypocrisy. The time is coming when everything that is covered up will be revealed, and all that is secret will be made known to all. Whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light, and whatever you have whispered behind closed doors will be shouted from the housetops for all to hear. Dear friends, don't be afraid of those who want to kill your body. They cannot do anything more to you after that. But I'll tell you whom to fear. Fear God, who has the power to kill you and then throw you into hell. He's the one to fear." The Pharisees that are doing bad things, don't fear them. Don't fear their contempt. Don't fear what they're doing, because if they're doing bad things and it's happening in the dark, it will get exposed. And so all that's happening are these people warning about the hypocrisy of these teachings, warning about the hypocrisies of Jim Bob, and warning about the abuses that are happening in the system. When you promote toxic beliefs like what Ben is doing by telling people that they cannot whine and complain, you're ignoring all the other advice that Jesus has given his followers. And you're also not standing with the victims in this case. Jesus told people that they could speak out against injustice. They could confront people. They could criticize religious leaders. None of that was off the table. In fact, he encouraged it. So this idea that you somehow need to forget all of that, forget the teachings of Christ, and just go straight to Philippians and say you can't whine or complain, all that does is fosters a toxic environment where abused victims have no platform to speak, are told that they have no right to complain, and that all disputes must be settled in a positive, happy way, because doing anything other than that just proves to atheists that you're a bad person.
If we turn on the news today, what do we see? We see strife. We see complaining. And this discontentment, which leads to rioting and revolutions and wars, complaining and resentment, murders and rebellions. People just can't seem to get along. But in the midst of this world, in the midst of this crooked and twisted generation, we're to be different. As Christians, we are to be marked by peace and love. Jesus even said, "By this they'll know that you're my disciples, by your love for one another." We're called to be peacemakers, and by being peacemakers, by being conflict resolvers, not just conflict starters, will be known as the children of God, as Jesus said in Matthew 5. as we are marked by contentment and joy, even in the midst of our trials, that will stand out in the midst of a world full of complaining. And we will be as light in the midst of the darkness.
I always feel like Ben and these types of Christians have it so wrong. Atheists like me do not point out bad behavior of Christians to say that they are not Christians or that they give Christianity a bad name. When I'm saying that what they're doing is wrong and they're not doing for victims and they're not helping victims is actually the opposite of what Christ would have done for his people. He was against harming children, right? He was constantly doing things for the poor and helping prostitutes, and he was always kind to women. And when we are sitting here saying it's okay to criticize bad teachers, it's okay to call out abuse, no one's telling you you have to be positive all the time. You don't have to be happy always. You don't have to sweep things under the rug. But what Ben is doing is he's allowing the abusers to stay in control and victims to be silenced. And so when people are criticizing them, it is not Christians that are ruining it for Christians. It is people that are abusing Christianity, that are ruining Christianity for people, not the other way around. When someone is hurt in the world of Christianity, they lose faith, or they can lose their faith because of what they've experienced. It's not the teachings that have hurt them, it's how they were treated. So you can't blame the people that have spoken out about the abuse they've experienced and say it's their fault for complaining, but rather look at the people that have caused the actual abuse that caused these people to call them out. It's not the fault of the complainer or the whiner, Ben. It's not the fault of the person that was hurt. It is the fault of the person that has hurt the person that used their position of power to hurt people. Jessa is not more virtuous than her sisters because she has not condemned what her father has done. She is not more virtuous because she has not condemned Josh. She is certainly not more virtuous because she has not condemned Bill Gothard. All she's done and all you've done, Ben, is proven to people like me that no matter what is said about this cult, no matter what is said about Jim Duggar, you will always protect the abuser and you will never listen to the abused, which is the exact opposite of what Jesus taught. And I always like to pull out the Bible when I talk about this kind of stuff because these people believe, Ben, Jessa, that they are so much better than me as a believer, as a non-believer, that I don't even have a right to an argument with them, and that I'm so dirty and I'm so wrong and I'm so like wicked that I'm just doing this to prove that Christianity is bad. And I'm not doing this to prove that Christianity is bad. I'm proving to say that they're hypocrites and what they're doing is hypocritical and that what they're doing is wrong. To sum this up, Derek and Jill have talked about how they followed Matthew 18 about trying to correct people in private, trying to handle disputes in private. But it says that once you can't handle your full dispute, you can consider that person a pagan or a corrupt tax collector. So chapter 18, verse 15 says, if another believer sins against you, go privately and point out the offense, which is what the Duggars want you to do. If the other person listens and confesses it, you have won the person back. But if you are unsuccessful, take one or two others with you and go back again, so that everything that you say may be confirmed by the 2 or 3 witnesses. If that person still refuses, then take your case to the church. Then, if he or she won't accept the church's decision, treat the person as a pagan or corrupt tax collector. I tell you the truth, whatever you forbid on earth will be forbidden in heaven, and whatever you permit on earth will be permitted in heaven. Derek and Jill went to Jim Bob and Michelle. They didn't listen. They tried to get counselors involved. They wouldn't do it. They have tried to go to church elders. They won't listen. At this point, Jim Bob has proven through Matthew 18 that he is no better than a pagan or an evil tax collector. And I would actually say that he's worse than that. He's just flat out evil. So even when you follow the rules, which he says, and someone's called out as a hypocrite, then they're not a hypocrite, according to Ben. But instead, stay positive, don't complain, don't grumble, because God forbid you actually have a complaint against the Pharisees, and instead allow the abusers to stay abusing you and be quiet about what you've experienced. And let's go to chapter 4 and talk about the silly ladies that gossip because, they're so gossipy ladies. Ben is one of the most toxic pastors I've ever dealt with, and this response is disgusting. And his choice to go through the book of Philippians is not a coincidence. And his choice to pick those 2 verses this week is not an accident. So they have spoken. Tell me what your thoughts are in the comments below. Bye, guys.